All right, everybody. I normally say this is Steve with Real Progressive, but tonight it is Steve sitting in for the great Jordan Sheraton at Status Coup. Welcome, everybody. Smash that like button. You know the routine. This channel survives on your donations. So please, if you guys can give a little bit, we love the help. In any event, we got a great show for you today. I'm thrilled to be sitting in this chair. Obviously Jordan is tough to follow, so bear with me. I'm standing on the shoulders of greatness. With that, folks, we had a great Super Bowl. For those of you who endeavored in the great bread and circuses of the weekend, we got to see some really fun stuff. But one of the things that jumped out, I don't know if you all watched the stupid commercials, but one of the commercials in particular that made the Super Bowl really, really wild was this bouncing around QR code. It was all over the screen. And tell me you didn't go ahead up to your screen if you were watching and take your phone and scan that QR code. And all of a sudden it takes you to Coinbase, of course. Crypto is everywhere. I mean, it's like in the end zones of the Super Bowl. It is literally everywhere. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about here in a moment, we're going to bring on our first guest here shortly, is Rohan Grey. And we're going to talk about the regulatory environment that is now really, really hot and heavy as it pertains to not just crypto, like the coins that you see most people investing in, but the overall strategy for how crypto and blockchain play into, the way the country operates. And it's going to be very interesting because there is a lot of very, very polarizing perspectives on this. So, Colin, do we have Rohan? Has Rohan joined us yet? There he is. Rohan, how are you, sir?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. So, we were just reading David Sirota's article, just a great one on the crypto is mining Congress. And as I'm reading through this article, I love David Sirota, but I love Rohan Grey more. And when I saw a quote from Rohan Grey in a daily poster, I was like, got to get this guy on. You have talked on many times. You're like the expert in this space, or at least one of the traveling experts anyway, to talk about the regulatory environment and what's happening in the crypto space. It's quite clear that Congress is being influenced by crypto. And there's a lot of things that are going on right here, right now, that are important for people to pay attention to, not just the rise and fall of Bitcoin. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on right now in the regulatory space with crypto?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think there's been a sort of long-standing interest in fintech. It's money and technology. It's Wall Street and Silicon Valley. It's the perfect confluence of power and wealth and control over key infrastructure, that it was always going to be a hot button area. And you can see this going back to PayPal or earlier debates over high frequency trading or internet banking in the 90s and things. And I think early days of the 2010s, there was still a bit of debate or a kind of cautious wait and see approach about how big these markets were going to get. I think it's clear now that they're here to stay in some way or another. That's not to say they can't fail, they don't have problems, but I think to the extent they could have been dismissed as a temporary phenomenon, that's gone, and now policymakers are asking themselves what to do about it. And of course, these markets have grown massively. What were a few $100 billion even 3 or 4 years ago are now in the trillions. And when you have exponential growth in value or market price in that sort of time frame, then a lot of people come out of the woodwork that start to care about those kinds of issues, to regulate them, to protect consumers, to either protect incumbents or to fight incumbents, and to deal with issues of systemic risk and how to define them relative to existing classifications. Is it a security? Is it money? Is it a bond? What is going on? How do we understand this technology? Is it new wine in old bottles or whatever else? And then I think the big shot heard around the world when it comes to stable coins in particular, and government digital currency, this question of should we do anything? Does this show that there's a need for us to change? Was with Facebook. I think that's pretty clear that you can divide the world of crypto before and after 2008, where you had the global financial crash and then you had Bitcoin. You can divide it before and after 2017 when the SEC said probably a lot of this stuff is a security that we haven't made that determination before, and you saw a pretty big shift in how the market was structured after that. And I think 2019, when Facebook announced that it was creating Libra, really scared governments to get involved and to say, if we don't do something, we're going to lose control over money to sort of the new world of tech and the internet economy.
So explain to me, we talk about CBDCs. Explain what a central bank digital currency is. I mean, it seems to me like this is one of the least understood things. And what does it actually do? Explain what it does and why it would even be talked about.
Yeah, I like to use the term digital fiat currency, or in the context of the United States, a digital dollar, because I think central bank digital currency is too limiting as a term. It's the term du jour around the world. If you ask most policymakers, that's the term they'll use. But that's in part because of a campaign that's already been successfully waged by central bankers to define the future of digital currency on terms that they get to control. The only thing the term central bank digital currency signifies is that it's issued by the central bank. It doesn't say whether it's issued in one design or another, who it's available to, what it's for. The only thing that has been determined up until this point under that framework is the central bank gets to decide things. And in my view, that's not the only way to look at it. There's the Treasury, there's the Postal Service. We should be looking at a digital dollar much more comprehensively across the government. But the thing that really differentiates most of those proposals, regardless of which entity issues it or which institution of the government is responsible for managing it, is that for the first time, a direct liability of the government would be available to average people. So until now, you go, well, I've got digital dollars already, don't I? I have a bank account, I have a Venmo app. What am I gaining by this? Well, you have an IOU of the bank, of Venmo, of PayPal. You do not own a direct instrument issued by the US government. The only instruments that you can own directly like that are coins issued by the mint, paper currency printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing and issued usually by the Federal Reserve in the form of Federal Reserve notes, or Treasury securities, Treasury bonds issued by Treasury directly to the public through the Treasury Direct program. Those are typically the only direct federal government liabilities you can hold. Everything else, bank deposits, would have a government guarantee, the full faith and credit of the United States that you see on that little plaque when you walk into the bank, or it is a direct IOU of a private actor like PayPal that either is backed up by assets or hopefully has enough safety that you can treat it as good as dollars. But basically, this is the first time that we get access to the mainframe. Up until now, the only people that could hold digital accounts at the Fed were banks or foreign governments or other, approved actors like that. But this would be the equivalent of a retail account service or a retail cash service for digital coins.
When we're looking at the typical crypto coins that everybody's like completely overheating over, just overly excited. I mean, you saw in the Super Bowl, if you watched the commercial, the bouncing QR code got me. I admit it. I clicked on it. But what is the difference really between cryptocurrency and government digital fiat, as you're saying? What is the difference there?
Well, the term cryptocurrency, doesn't have one clear definition. I would say that usually when we think of the word cryptocurrency, we're talking about currency systems that are secured using cryptographic technology, which arguably applies to regular money as well. If you've ever seen that little lock when you try to buy something with a credit card, it'll say SSL certificate or something. That's a form of cryptographic security that allows us to make payments over the internet without that information being available to anyone to easily steal. So we already use cryptography, but the way that cryptocurrency as a term became popular was the idea that instead of relying on a central issuer, you would rely on a network of untrusted actors who would essentially contribute computing power or other resources to keep the network alive. And so instead of having a government be the central issuer of the dollar, you would have a dollar that's issued through a network of actors who together in theory, through their self-interest, produce a common good. Almost a kind of pure distillation of the neoliberal idea that we can create public goods through coordinated private market activity. And I think of it in two layers, really. I think of it in terms of who makes the commitment, what the legal obligation is, and then secondly, the technological architecture of the payment system, how it's designed, how it runs. A instrument that is either issued by the US government or guaranteed by the US government, I consider a form of public money. The full faith and credit of the entire legal system, the social political system backs that up. A privately issued digital currency does not have that backing. It can either be backed up by the institution that issues it, if there's one entity, or it could be the assets that are held against that instrument. So, there's a sort of pot of money or a pot of assets, whether it's crypto or treasury securities or bank deposits. And you can access those on demand if there's enough of them, and that's what keeps the value stable. But we are, in that context, there's nothing, I think, really unique about cryptocurrencies other than how many people are involved with it or how the asset backing is set up. There's been private monies operating alongside public money for thousands of years or hundreds of years in Western contexts. I lived in Ithaca, upstate New York. There's an Ithaca dollar that was issued as a community currency. There have been company scrip that's been issued by private companies that, you could pay at the local store in the company town. There's been all sorts of privately issued monies throughout the ages. Before bank deposits were government insured, they were bank notes printed by individual private banks. Often they had government privileges, like they could be used in payment of taxes, which gave them additional benefits, but they were still a private obligation at that point. The second layer is the payment system itself, how you make payments. And within the public money system, there are different kinds, right? You and I use cash. We can use it in some places, not others. Make the example, if you need to buy a candy bar, it's probably good to have coins. If you need to buy a car, it's probably not good to have coins, right? Same thing with $100 bills. Same thing with your bank account. If you'd like to earn 7% interest right now, it's probably good to invest in an I-series savings bond at Treasury. If you want to earn no interest but be able to make payments with your money, you probably want it in a bank account. So there's already different payments networks, payments architectures within public money. What these private cryptocurrencies offer is a different kind of payments network, whether it's stable coins or a blockchain-based network that can incorporate smart contracts, or can operate across jurisdictions or in places where banks will not allow you to make payments, casinos, online gambling, that kind of thing. So in that respect, I would say private currencies are, on one hand, a very old story of privately issued money and a somewhat new story of digital payments technology.
So let's jump into Congress for a moment. We got guys like Ted Cruz and others who are being backed by crypto, and they have their own interests at play here right now. Obviously, that's not great. But, just before I go too far down that path, I want to make one distinction. I know that, as many of us leftists would go, it was Occupy Wall Street that we were focused on, trying to bring about changes in investing in Wall Street. What's the difference between Wall Street being in New York City and crypto being out of Silicon Valley, so to speak? I mean, it seems like two forms of oligarchy controlling an investment Ponzi scheme that the people that are heavy investors get to win and the little guy typically does not. Is there a difference here? I mean, are we kind of giving a pass to Wall Street West?
I think anyone that says that the status quo is working is part of the problem. And I think one of the reasons that crypto has managed to grow the way that it has is because it's identified a real problem, which is the current system doesn't provide even basic payment services to millions of people. People don't trust banks. People don't have reliable, safe ways to have pensions and retirement funds, those kinds of things without gambling in the casino. And it's been very clear, at least since 2008, and certainly for longer for those who are paying attention, that those actors who are ostensibly on your side are not often on your side. They're often betting against you while supposedly being your advisors and things like that. So in that respect, I think, if the debate gets framed as crypto is offering a challenge to the status quo and everybody who's anti-crypto is pro the status quo, we've lost. I think it's really imperative to articulate a real diagnosis of the problem today and offer an alternative. That said, I think we've had very many years of sort of laissez-faire, unregulated private markets, even securities regulation, which I'm very skeptical of a very effective regulatory regime, didn't exist at all at the federal level until the 1930s. And it didn't exist at the state level in the US till the 1910s. It was a sort of wild west with private, people selling penny stocks and bonds and things in a manner similar to selling snake oil. They'd sort of knock on your door and try to sell you some stock and say, it's 1880. This is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And oftentimes it was just completely fraudulent. So in that respect, I would say the banking laws that we've had since, the 1860s and then the 1930s with deposit insurance, the laws around securities regulation, the laws around payment system regulation are attempts to constrain these private actors from doing whatever they want. And crypto, to the extent that it's different, is in part a huge step backwards. It's in part a huge reset of those debates. And it says, what if we got to relitigate whether we should be regulated at all?
Right.
And you'd say, well, we have 70 years of history that says that we shouldn't relitigate that, right? We don't want to relitigate whether vaccines are good from like the first principles. We've already had that debate 50 years ago. And then someone says, well, okay, but what if we added the word tech in front of it? Can we relitigate it now? What if we say, oh, it's fancy and shiny and new? Can we relitigate it now?
Right.
And, you say no, and everyone else goes, wow, it's new, it's fancy, it's shiny. Oh, I guess we should have this debate from first principles. So I'm a big believer of that Buckminster Fuller line, that if you really want to change the world, you don't try to change the existing reality, you build a new one to render the old one obsolete. And I would say that what crypto is to a large degree is a new generation of people with technical capacity and capital, of computer systems, software, things like that, going, we're going to revamp the financial system and get a seat at the table with those old established players. Because remember, back in the day, it was banks who controlled the information network for payments. If you have hundreds of banks across the country, you're processing payments like a mini distributed network. And then if you create Western Union and the Telegraph, you create the payments processes. You run the telephone system in sub-Saharan Africa. You create mobile money. There's always been a link between finance and control over key information infrastructure. So they say, we've got new information infrastructure, we've got software capacity, and we want a seat at the table with a relatively entrenched financial system. And we got enough money to throw at lawmakers to give us a green light to, basically relitigate whether or not securities laws should apply at all, whether or not banking laws should apply at all. And so you have shadow banks that are issuing something that by all accounts is a shadow bank deposit, but are not being regulated like a bank. You have actors that are by all accounts issuing securities that are not being regulated like a securities issuer. You have actors that are by all accounts are functioning as an exchange that are not being regulated as an exchange. And it's not that they're doing anything fundamentally new, although if you ask them, the differences are always new. Just like if you ask Windows 10 is better than Windows 7 or something, Right. But they're not doing anything fundamentally different other than relitigating the existing social contract in ways that are more favorable to the interests of private finance and tech.
So, obviously the pandemic gave a lot of people a lot of spare time to do some different things. And you saw the rise of crypto blow up during the pandemic. I'm curious, and this is just a quick segue to the next subject that I wanted to raise with you, but is there a case to be made that crypto is feeding into the inflation that we see, just simply because of asset inflation or obviously, investment securities, savings accounts, things like that, the desire for savings, or a bit of a demand leakage? This seems to be much more liquid. I'm curious, what impact, if any, does crypto have on inflation?
I think if you look at the particular drivers of price increases right now, they're not in sectors largely that are impacted by crypto, although, for example, there's a huge amount of need for, computer processors and things and chips that are not, it's not the same chips that go into crypto mining rigs as that are experiencing shortages. But if there wasn't so much demand for crypto mining rigs, presumably actors with the capacity to build computer chips and things might be looking elsewhere to invest and build new, equipment. But as a general matter, I would say in terms of general demand and also just the degree of financial speculation that's going on, if you clamped down on crypto the way that it should have been, there would be a lot less wealth being held by a lot of people right now. And a lot of that wealth that's written now on paper as existing is sort of like when you sell shares of a company and they're priced at a certain amount. And then you say, well, compared to all the shares of that company, now the founder that owns 50% of the shares is worth $100 billion or something, the Elon Musk example. Now, if most of his wealth is stored in the form of shares and the price of those shares can fluctuate, then on paper, he's got $200 billion. In practice, he doesn't have anything like that. But he can still use that on paper value to, command new ventures, to set up new businesses, to consume, etc. So if people were not able to, inflate the value of their wealth through assets whose prices may not actually be at all representative underlying real social value, including crypto, then we would see a different distribution of wealth and income and probably reduced demand overall. And maybe we would also just have more social pressure to change other policies, right? If we do have persistent low interest rates, but there's a lot of people that think that we should have better savings options for people who want to retire on pensions, then one option is, call up your grandparents and tell them to invest in crypto. Another option is, we should have a public pension system that pays a fixed amount out, even as we keep interest rates low in the private sector. But the way that we will keep interest rates low is by combining that with tight financial regulation, so that that doesn't lead to inflated asset values and increased speculation and more of that kind of irrational exuberance and sort of mania that you see with the crypto world, where people are desperately trying to find, higher and higher yields, and in doing so are taking on more and more risk that may or may not be sort of in line with their particular risk profiles. People who want to invest in retirements don't want to lose their retirement. But a lot of this stuff going on right now, it seems like it's too good to be true, or it seems like it's a sure thing or something. Yeah, that's right. Or everybody's making money here. Why don't I get to make some? And the answer is, well, if everybody drinks from the poison chalice, that doesn't mean you want to do so too. And one example of this that's coming up a lot is celebrities. A lot of celebrities are pumping crypto, often cynically because they're getting paid. This is sort of like when you do those cameos where you can pay a celebrity to wish your friend a happy birthday or something. But in this case, it's Kim Kardashian pumping some coin, or Matt Damon or something. And in other situations, they've just been bamboozled by one of these crypto people. They've promised them insane returns. They've promised them that their face on a coin or something. And so they become a spokesperson for these ventures that they think sound exciting and cool, but in fact are scams, or at the very least predatory. And people buy into them because a lot of this stuff is cultural. Right? You can,
if we got rid of the word crypto and we just described what was going on, I think a lot of the people that say they love crypto might be offended. I think
if we just called them if we called half of them derivatives. I mean, there was a point in time when the word derivative was a dirty word. Oh, we need to regulate derivatives. The deregulation of derivatives was a terrible development in the 90s. Well, what if we added the word tech in front of it? It's the same story over and over. What if we created a really cool looking icon of a digital coin and then called it a derivative? I mean, the word derivative sounds like a math class that you were forced to take over summer. It's unpleasant. A digital coin that Kim Kardashian promoted on Instagram sounds cool. I mean, there really is a huge cultural dimension to all of this. And you add cool culture with extremely high returns, and it's a recipe for scams and big crashes.
Yeah, Bill Black's recipe for fraud is baked right there. Absolutely. So look, I know you've got a hard stop here in just a minute. I just want to touch on that thing we talked about with Ted Cruz real quick to close us out. It seems like this is something that we need to get our arms wrapped around. We already have a lot of insider trading going on within Congress. A lot of really, really bad, corrupt behavior. Talk to us about that, and then I'll let you get out of here.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's three layers. The first is donations. So when you've got this large industry that's growing at this rate, they've got a lot of money to throw around. Right? They've got a lot of investment capital coming in, venture capitalists, the big hedge funds, this is not This is not some revolutionary upstart Edward Snowden behind a computer at this point. We're talking about Andreessen Horowitz. We're talking about BlackRock. We're talking about Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan. These are the big pots of money out there in the world that are getting into crypto. And even the ones that frame themselves as upstarts were like the mildly small hedge fund on Wall Street, or the guy who used to be a general manager and left to do his own thing. You know, we're not talking about people that were sort of 25 years working on the factory floor and then decided to become the evangelist for crypto. These are usually market participants that have cynically adopted populist language. But when they've got that much money, then hiring a lobbying wing for your industry is pretty easy and obvious. So there is a blockchain association that lobbies Congress. There are, there's a coin center, which is a sort of think tank that again provides policy advice in the interest of the industry. They have a huge amount of money to throw around. Tom Emmer, who has become one of the big leaders, has, I think, received $200,000 from crypto industries recently. Ted Cruz has received a lot. Cynthia Loomis has received a lot. They're throwing that money around as quickly as they can. And, tech itself as an industry 15 years ago was not a big player in the lobbying scene. Now it's some of the largest lobbyists in DC. And crypto will do the same thing because, as I said, it's at that perfect sweet spot in the Venn diagram between Wall Street and Silicon Valley. The second layer is just investments. And as you mentioned, there's been a huge amount of issues around insider trading, but also a huge amount of members of Congress are filthy rich. I mean, we're talking about multimillionaires. Yeah. We're talking about people that get up every day and they care much less about their salary than they do about their portfolio. That's where they're making their money every day. Their salary is a rounding error relative to the returns they get on their investments. There's a reason that Obama comes in worth a few $1 million and leaves with 50 million. And that's a common strategy. So when you have the option to maybe all above board, you're not sort of having a meeting with one company and then going investing in that stock, but you get to hear what's coming down the pipeline. You get a sense of what everyone else is talking about in DC. You get to see these insane returns, and you know that those returns are at least going to stay alive for a while because of how slow the regulatory system is moving. Then you've got the means, you've got a lot of money, you're a rich congressperson, you've got the opportunity. It's sort of, I would be extremely shocked if people like Cynthia Loomis were not standing to make a lot of money as the crypto industry grows. And then lastly, you've got the revolving door. And this is as important for regulators as it is for members of Congress, probably even more important, but also for the staffers. The number of staffers, even from the Democratic side, that leave positions on the House Financial Services Committee or the Senate Banking Committee to work for crypto companies, because the crypto companies like having insiders who can get people on the phone, who know how things are done, all that kind of stuff. Buying themselves a seat at the table, buying themselves insider access is huge. People who are otherwise progressives who are now working for crypto exchanges or startup ventures and things like this. And it was Stripe before that, and it was PayPal before that. So I think if you combine those three layers of kind of just regular political donations, the investments of members of Congress, and the revolving door in and out of the industry, there's just a lot of money to be made for cynical, self-interested actors for going light touch with regulation of this industry. You don't need to sort of hand over one bag of corruption in exchange for a bag of money, but the general attitude to be more permissive and supportive than the social benefit may otherwise justify is very real.
Well, Rohan Grey is just an amazing guy. Follow him on Twitter. Rohan, where can we find more of your work? Because you're with the Modern Money Network, Modern Money Action. Go ahead and let us know where we can find more of your work.
Yeah. I mean, I'm on Twitter at Rohan Grey. I'm assistant professor of law at Willamette University in Oregon. I work with Modern Money Network, Public Money Action, which is our lobbying side. You can just sort of find me online in general.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful. I appreciate your time. Folks, smash that like button. Share this around. We appreciate your help. All right. So the next thing we're going to talk about here, for those of you all who are on Facebook still, and I know Facebook really kind of has screwed itself. It used to be a pretty decent platform years ago, but as they keep going more and more and more, screwing themselves up, the fact checkers are out there banning stuff about inflation. The subject we're going to be talking with our next guest here in a few minutes. But I want to talk, before we get into that, I want to talk to you about an article by Chris Hedges. Colin, could you go ahead and pop that article up by Chris Hedges? So Christopher Hedges, great writer, as you all know, went around and wrote this fantastic piece. If you haven't read it, it's on a couple different platforms. I think it's on the Share Report, it's on Counterpunch, and so forth. But what he talks about here is Democrats are the more effective evil. And, you know, this is just a fact, Jack. If you'll scroll down a little bit, I'm going to read this to you because, I mean, this is just mind-blowing, okay? This is absolutely mind-blowing. What he says is, when all else fails, when you're clueless about how to halt 7.5% interest rate, when your Build Back Better bill is gutted, when you renege on your promise to raise the minimum wage or forgive student debt, when you can't halt the Republican suppression of voting rights, when you have no idea how to handle the pandemic, which has claimed 900,000 lives, 16% of the world's total deaths, although we are less than 5% of the world's population. When the stock market fluctuates on wild roller coaster rides of highs and lows, when what little help the government offered to the labor force, half of whom, 80 million, experienced a period of unemployment last year, sees the termination of the extended unemployment benefits, rental assistance, forbearance for student loans, emergency checks, the moratorium on evictions, and expansion of the child tax credits, when you watch passively as the eco side gathers momentum, then you must make the public afraid of enemies, foreign and domestic. You must manufacture an existential threat. Terrorists at home, Russians and Chinese abroad, expand state power in the name of national security, beat the drums of war. War is the antidote to divert public attention. We've seen this before, right? From government corruption and incompetence. No one plays the game better than the Democratic Party. The Democrats, as journalist and co-founder of Black Agenda Report Glenn Ford said, are not the lesser of evil. They are the more effective evil. Rest in peace, Glenn Ford. I want to read this last part of the quote here because this is really, really important as well. And there's a lot more to this article, but I want you all to hear this because I think this will play into what we talk about with our next guest. The U.S., burdened by de facto tax boycotts by the rich and corporations, is sinking in debt. Sorry, Chris, you got it wrong. There you get it wrong. This is one of those things where Chris Hedges probably needs to stay out of the economic discussions. Okay. But the government budget deficit was $2.77 trillion for the 2021 budget year that ended September 30th, the second highest annual deficit on record. Do you see this? I want you all to understand why I'm reading this. As you heard the first part, you're like, yes, yes, yes. And then Christopher Hedges starts playing into the neoclassical standard bullshit jargon about deficits and debt. It's like, dude, have you not read Stephanie Kelton's Deficit Myth book? I love you to death. You're one of the best there is, but this is just unacceptable. It's like the total U.S. national debt is over 30 trillion. Household debt grew by 1 trillion last year. Now that matters. Household debt rising 1 trillion and that matters. U.S. government can always pay its debts, period, full stop. But you and I, think about what your bank account looks like. Think about what your credit looks like. Think about what happens when you take on too much credit card debt, when life happens and you can't pay your bills. See, this is playing on that. But this is not the same thing. National debt is the United States government, and it creates a currency. It can never go broke. So Chris Hedges, learn you some economics, brother. Anyway, let's get out of this one, Colin, if you don't mind. I want to make sure that everyone understands that there's a lot of misinformation right now about the economy and about inflation and the entire story that goes into having a legitimate conversation about how to fix these problems. You can't fix them if you don't understand them. And clearly, Chris Hedges, while he understands how bad the Democrats are, does not understand inflation, does not understand economics. And that brings me back to the Facebook thing. Colin, go ahead and throw those memes up there about there you go. So this meme right here is getting flagged all over Facebook. It's literally getting flagged all over Facebook. Because why? Well, on Facebook, they have fact checkers, and fact checkers say it can't be corporate greed that's causing inflation. It has to be printing money. It has to be all these stupid things that people that don't know anything about economics say. But here's Facebook playing Lord God Emperor, feeding into the same bullshit narrative. First, we heard Chris Hedges, who we all love, give you a bullshit narrative about inflation. Now we see Facebook cracking down using, and wait till you get this, they're using AEI, the conservative piece of garbage economics blast out there telling you that it couldn't possibly be corporate greed creating inflation. I think this is one of those things where, Colin, you can take that off. This is one of those things where if you allow these kinds of narratives to stand, rank and file people who read Chris Hedges' article, good article, by the way, but then they see these things, they start coming up with this bullshit right-wing narrative that literally eliminates any potential of us surviving these kinds of threats. So I said, I'm going to bring on one of the sharpest minds out there in Fadhel Kaboub. Dr. Fadhel Kaboub is an economist and a good friend, and there he is. Hey, welcome to the show, sir. Folks,
good to see you, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Smash the like button, and also please share this video around. Fadhel, welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks for having me on the show. Good to see you, Steve.
Absolutely. So this is Status Coup, man. It's a little different. I keep wanting to say, Steve, for real, but we're Status Coup. With that in mind, you see, if you heard what I was talking about, we have Chris Hedges, who we all know and love because he's got a lot of truth telling. He is just not a guy to ever listen to for anything that has anything to do with economics. The guy is just not there yet. We got to work on it, folks. Got to work on it. But then you see Facebook literally cracking down and calling this BS. But if you look at who the source is that they're using, it's AEI. Of all the places that they would use for fact-checking economics, they're using that conservative think tank. Can you give us the story about what's going on with inflation?
Well, I'm glad you brought this up because this is really an important turning point that will stay with us for decades. If we lose this debate and if we lose this this debate over the narrative about what actually causes inflation and how we tackle inflation, they're going to use this for decades to come to blame the inflation of the pandemic on, the government spending too much money on helping the unemployed and poor children and all of that, and using it against us for decades to come to balance the budget and the whole inflation phobia and the deficit phobia and so on. So that's why it's important to really have a counter narrative to call their bluff, not just Facebook, but everybody else who's been panicking about the inflation situation and pointing in the wrong direction. So when you look at pre-pandemic, what the drivers of inflation were in the US, and just to be very, very straightforward, inflation is basically the average price level going up from month to month, from year to year. That's what we call inflation. And it affects obviously the cost of living for most of us. So pre-pandemic in the US, we had four basic drivers of inflation that most people recognize. And those were healthcare, education, energy and transportation, and real estate. And with the effects of the pandemic disruptions to global supply chains and so on, we've had additional inflation pressure points related to logistics and shipping and particular products related to microchips and things like that. So when you look at inflation pressure points and actual prices going up, there's usually two factors that affect it. One has to do with the lack of productive capacity. In other words, when we run out of raw materials and skilled people to produce stuff and there's more demand, inflation will happen and those prices will go up. The good news about this is that with strategic investments in key areas, we can produce more. Productive capacity is producible. We employ millions of people, we increase productive capacity, and we tame that source of inflation at the source, whether it's housing or real estate or education and so on. But when you add the second factor, then you'll understand the problem we're dealing with the hijacking of the narrative. The second effect that actually causes inflation pressure points has to do with what we call abusive market power. When you're influential enough in the market, when you're dominant enough, you can raise prices simply because you can. And you can raise prices even more during a pandemic and during an inflation phobia moment, because everybody's already in tune with the idea of inflation. So you just tell them, well, we're covering our cost of doing business, so that's why we're raising prices, when we really understand, and most people have seen it right now, that they're actually not just covering the cost of doing business related to the pandemic. They're actually taking advantage above and beyond. And that kind of inflation that's driven by abusive market power, you can't get rid of it by spending less or by cutting the deficit or by reducing subsidies to the poor, to the unemployed, to hungry children. You only deal with it by taxing and regulating their abusive market power out of existence. In other words, you democratize the market, you make it more competitive, and you make it less monopolistic. And that's the problem, because who are the lawmakers who are supposed to do this, to tax and regulate this abusive market power? It's the 535 people we elect in Washington, D.C. Are they a government of the people, by the people, for the people? If that's the case, then we have a democracy.
United Corporations of America.
Exactly. But they're a government of the super PACs, by the super PACs, for the super PACs. And that's why this inflation question is really a question of democracy. It's a question of survival. And if we lose the debate about how we actually tame inflation, they're going to use this narrative against us for years to come.
That's a great point. I want to bring up, obviously the Fed is talking about tightening monetary policy, talking about increasing interest rates, talking about going and using old tools they used in previous recessions and things like that.
Yep.
When we sit there and put inflation as the cure by using interest rates, we in effect create inflation. At least that's what Warren Mosler would say. I'm curious, why do they keep falling back to the concept of raising interest rates at the Fed to stave off inflation? What is the point of that?
Because their theory of inflation and their understanding of inflation, which is not pure economics, it's political too, and it's
Mysticism.
ideological. It has to do with the assumption that inflation is driven by too much demand, because the government spent too much during the pandemic. We've been so generous with the poor, with the unemployed, with people who have been displaced by the pandemic, with children, so that we get at least half of them out of poverty during the pandemic. We've been so generous that we've fed people so much income that they've gone out on a shopping spree, and now they're spending too much and the economy can't handle it. So what we're going to do, we're going to take away the spending, which is where the fiscal spending cuts are going to happen. And at the same time, we're going to raise interest rates to increase the cost of borrowing, to slow down additional spending. And when you do this, you're essentially automatically throwing people under the bus. And it's actually worse. You're actually not taming the sources of inflation. Now tell me, Steve, how is raising the interest rate going to stop the COVID spread, stop the supply chain disruptions? How is it going to stop the abusive market power of pharmaceuticals, of real estate companies, of oil and gas companies? It does nothing to it. So we're not addressing the source of inflation. We're just sacrificing millions of people, throwing them under the bus in the name of fighting inflation. And this is not the first time they've used this. This is the narrative that was used in the 70s. And it's important for people to remember their history and understand it with the counter narrative. Because most people, including a lot of progressives today, they say, oh, we've seen this before, the inflation of the 70s. That's how we ended the inflation of the 70s. The Fed raised interest rates, and Reagan and Thatcher cut spending and privatized everything. And eventually we broke the back of inflation.
It wins.
Completely false. The source of inflation in the 70s was a political conflict in the Middle East. It had nothing to do with labor unions, nothing to do with the welfare state, nothing to do with the Federal Reserve Bank. But they hijacked the moment, the political moment, to their advantage, political advantage, and said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go after spending, right? We're going to go after labor unions. We're going to cut government spending. We're going to balance the budget. We're going to be fiscally conservative. And we're going to have the Fed raise interest rates to break the back of inflation. Well, guess how we tamed inflation in the US? The first step was finding a substitute to imported energy, because energy was the source of inflation. It feeds into everything we consume: petrochemicals, your hair product, your textiles, your transportation, your heating and cooling. All of it is cost related to oil prices. So what we did and Jimmy Carter was part of this, was to deregulate the natural gas industry and started the fracking frenzy that we deal with today, because natural gas was a substitute for at least heating and cooling and producing electricity. That was one step. Jimmy Carter put a solar panel on the White House and was trying to encourage renewables, which Reagan immediately took down, by the way. But the ultimate thing that broke the back of inflation was not the Fed, it wasn't Volcker, it was finding a peaceful resolution to the conflict in the Middle East and signing a peace accord. That brought down oil prices, which completely brought down the ripple effect of oil prices throughout the system. But they hijacked the narrative and they told us the way we won the inflation fight of the 70s was with being fiscally conservative and by raising interest rates. And now they're going to repeat the same hijacking process to ignore completely the actual sources of inflation that we're dealing with. Definitely don't bring up the abusive market power of pharmaceuticals and real estate and banking and finance. You've heard all the gatekeepers in the last few days come online on national TV saying, no, it's not corporations, it's not greed. This is, we live with corporations and competition, all of that. It's just too much spending, and we need to raise interest rates and cut spending. And if we lose this debate, if we don't call their bluff, they're going to win this narrative, and they're going to use it against us for decades to come to continue to throw people under the bus and say, we can't afford all that spending on welfare, on the Green New Deal, on healthcare, on education. We can only afford the status quo.
I want to touch on this real quick. So we've got a couple lies that really feed into this. Number one, I saw people fawning over the fact that I said, don't listen to Chris Hedges about economics. Well, Chris Hedges is not an economist, folks. There's no knock on him. There's a lot of people out there that don't understand economics. And there's a lot of microeconomists that have no idea about macro. And there's a lot of people that claim to be macroeconomists that are committing genocide, in my opinion, with the lies that they tell as well. But in Hedges' article, he talks about the national debt like it's a big boogeyman. This is right-wing talking point, whether he realizes it or not. Sound money talking point, whether he realizes it or not. The deficit myth, which Stephanie Kelton has destroyed. He's still harping on it. So we got that. But then let's sew in the crypto side. Crypto is out there running around ignorantly. And I mean, when I say ignorant, I just want to do one of my worthless statements where they're talking about debasing the currency. And I'm saying to myself, first of all, to debase something, you're looking at gold, a gold standard where you have a pool of gold and you print 10 tokens against a pool of gold. You say, hey, I want to debase it.
To debase it.
Exactly. So now we're going to go ahead and print 20 tokens against the gold. The gold is static, I should say, the money we've cut. So it's like getting a pizza. You get 8 slices, say, I'm going to cut it in a bunch more and cut it to 16. We just debase the pizza. Okay. Why is it that crypto gets away with telling people that they're debasing the currency, and people just go like it's mother's milk? They don't even question it. It's just like, But this is like the most destructive and stupid comment known to mankind. What does that lie do to our ability to fight the narrative that we are so desperately in a locked horn war with about inflation? Once they start lying about debasing the currency, because these are the right-wing crypto people doing this. These are the Milton Friedman school of thought, the Chicago school, the neoliberals, and people are sitting there going, they're my friend. I love them. They say crypto. What's going on there? I mean, for real, this is a big deal. The debasing thing is everyone. It comes, the first thing out of their mouth is we're debasing the dollar. Talk about that.
Yeah, they're building on a pre-existing myth that the mainstream of the economics profession, even some progressive for what it's worth, have believed in for a long time, that the dollar is still based on a gold standard, which is not true. We've been off the gold standard. We've been on a fiat currency system for decades, which means the dollar is not tied to any physical commodity like gold or silver or anything else. And that is mind-blowing for a lot of people. You mean it's just a piece of paper? It's just something that the government creates out of thin air? And the answer is yes. What matters is what we do with the money that we spend. It's not the fact that it's coming out of thin air. So what matters is what that's why a lot of us kind of came out of this functional finance tradition that says it's not the deficit that matters, it's not the level of the debt that matters, it's the function, it's the purpose. That's why we call it functional finance. And that is to say, if we use the power of the purse, the federal government spending in order to increase productive capacity, create useful, meaningful, productive capacity so that we can prosper when it comes to health, education, transportation, renewable energy, fighting climate change. And we do it not in a sense of infinite money printing, because then you're not keeping up with the productive capacity, but we do it in a level that is commensurate with the needs of the economy. You pay people decent wages, you create the resources, the real resources that you need, and you tackle the real economic and ecological and social challenges. But then the taxing, which is where the balancing the budget idea comes from, the taxing comes in the MMT framework, not because we don't tax because we need their money or their permission to pay for health or education. We don't tax pollution because we need their money to invest in a Green New Deal. We tax pollution because we want to decarbonize. We tax abusive market power out of existence. We tax speculation. We tax gambling. We tax whatever the purpose of taxation is. It's definitely not to fund federal spending for these purposes that I mentioned. So we decouple the taxing and spending. And if the deficit gets larger, so be it. It's really the purpose of the taxing and spending that matters. So we're not constrained with the tax revenues. We're not constrained by a budget limit or a debt ceiling or any of those mainstream constraints that people usually think of. It's the function that you put in place. It's the public purpose that you serve that matters. And I'll give you a couple examples just to illustrate why this is a myth, and the cryptomania is building on these myths. Think of World War II. When we were entering into World War II, we came out of the Great Depression. There was no money to be taxed. There was no money to be borrowed. How did we fund the largest government intervention in the history of the universe at the time? Well, where did money come from? Well, the government used its power of the purse and set a national priority to win the war. We didn't say we're going to do it in an incremental way, send them 10,000 soldiers every other month and see if we can win this thing. We went big. And the constraint at the time, which everybody was aware of, was not finding the money. It was finding the real resources, the productive capacity. That's why we shut down manufacturing of automobiles in Detroit to produce tanks and airplanes, because we needed to prioritize the resources. So it's not the deficit that matters. It's not the national debt that matters. It's the real resources and what you do with them for the public purpose. The concern about inflation during World War II was, what if all the workers that we hired, we went from a Great Depression to full employment? What if all the workers go out on a shopping spree and buy new cars and new homes and new things? We don't actually have the physical resources for them. So we would have had great inflation related to real estate and consumer goods and so on. That's where the freedom bonds came in. Freedom bonds were not sold before the war to fund the war. They were sold during the war, after the spending already took place. And it was a way to capitalize on the patriotic mood of the nation, to say to those workers, basically, please postpone your consumption for that new car, for that new home until after the war. Buy freedom bonds. And after the war, we'll pay you back plus interest. And then you can go and buy your new house. You can go and buy your new car, because by then we don't need tanks and airplanes. We'll have plenty of capacity to produce furniture and cars and homes. And Boeing at the time, after the war, started manufacturing living rooms and dining tables for consumers, not airplanes and tanks. So we know how to do this. It's just now, decades later, they tell us we don't know how to do this. The government is broke. We don't have any fiscal capacity. We have to live within our means and balance the budget and all of that. And when you neglect people for so long and throw communities into so much neglect and so much state of desperation, then they're going to wrestle and muddle through to find a way for themselves. And that state of desperation is now like a fertile ground for cryptomania. And a lot of people who are going after the crypto dream are actually desperate to make money, because there is no gainful employment, there is no thriving opportunities, there is no job guarantee, there is no pension guarantee, none of that. There's no guaranteed healthcare. People are struggling, and that's where we're preying on people of color. We're preying on low-income people. More than 40% of crypto owners right now have never invested in anything. And this is kind of the thing that's going to change their life. And what Rohan Grey was saying earlier is absolutely correct. This cultural phenomenon around crypto based on mythology is a recipe for disaster. It's classic pump and dump strategy for a new class of assets, for a new speculative bubble. And the government is joining in, central banks are joining in. It's a classic disaster in the making.
I want to touch on something. Alan Greenspan and famously fought with Paul Ryan during an interview that they had in Congress. And Paul Ryan comes out and is like, wouldn't it make Social Security more solvent if we privatized it, made it savings accounts? And Alan Greenspan said, that really wouldn't do a thing for us, because ultimately we can spend as much money as we need. There's no issue with creating as much money as we need. The issue is, do we have the real resources for sale to absorb that spending? So I want to take it back, and I'm going to do something I rarely do, which is kind of defend at least an idea. Biden has failed miserably, as I read off that list of everything he has not even tried to do or has not done. But one thing that he did say was that in part of this infrastructure bill was they were going to invest strategically in capacity plan to enable us to compete, to make us more productive, so we can eliminate those bottlenecks in the supply chain. Now, he's a lot of talk, and I haven't seen any evidence it's going to happen, but I want people to understand that is exactly why when people are laughing, how's he going to tame inflation by spending money? Well, you spend money targeted to enhance the productive capacity of the nation, to increase our productive sovereignty, to allow us to be able to do those things. Talk about that for just a minute, because I think that this is another one of those moments where a smarter, more informed activist community is going to be able to do a lot more damage to the establishment and the oligarchy if they are actually packing real knowledge versus just, wooden swords and, face masks made out of cardboard. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, this is what we've been saying in the MMT community for years now. In order to tame the actual sources of inflation, you have to do two things. One is spend more, not less, strategically in key areas to increase the productive capacity. So you don't have shortages, so you don't have bottlenecks, so you don't have to rely on global supply chains. So that's where spending more actually reduces inflation. The mainstream will tell you if you spend more, it will cause more inflation. So that's point number one. And the good news is that you create jobs and you become more resilient to global shocks, pandemic shocks, shortages, and all of that. That's one aspect of it. And that's the aspect that Biden in a way is understanding. The second aspect, which is not, I doubt he's going to do anything about it, because this is where the establishment lives, which is taxing and regulating abusive market power in key areas where we actually have inflation pressure points and had inflation pressure points. And that's where it becomes a question of democracy. Where is this abusive market power? It's the 5 global companies that control food prices. It's the speculative behavior on Wall Street to speculative and commodity prices. It's the pharmaceuticals. It's the health insurance industry. Are you going after those? Well, if you're going to go after them, you also have to kind of introduce a Medicare for all so that you increase productive capacity and, bring down costs and so on. This is why we had a thing, what is it called? A Green New Deal that had those 4 features in it, which is spend more to decarbonize, to tax and regulate abusive market power, to create a affordable housing, homes guarantee program, to include Medicare for all, to go after the power and influence of pharmaceuticals and health insurance companies. That's why we've had a whole program called the Green New Deal, because it wasn't just a favorite shopping list of the progressives. It was well-designed economic strategy to tame the sources of inflation, decarbonize and transform the system, and produce millions of jobs in the process. Now, who's opposed to it? It's the handful of politicians we sent to Washington, D.C., their lobbyists, the super PACs that support them, and the media companies that spin their stories. Who are the consumers of those stories? It's unfortunately a lot of progressive and well-meaning people who are not well informed, who have been bamboozled into a narrative that says we can't afford any of this pie in the sky Green Deal thing that they talk about, as Nancy Pelosi or whoever one time said it. So that's why I'm all for the revolution, and I'm all for the pitchforks, and I'm all for the rebellion of Chris Hedges and everybody else. But it's not sufficient to have pitchforks. You have to have well-informed pitchforks so you can push back and call their bluff when they say we can't afford your thing.
You know, I want to raise this point, and then I'm going to move on to another aspect of this. You know, one of the things that we see is a frequent rush by a lot of well-meaning progressives, and they want to do a constitutional convention, not understanding that the Mount Pelerin Society, the Chicago School, the libertarians led by the likes of Milton Friedman back in the day and others, the Powell Memo, on and on and on, they have been praying to God that we are dumb enough to beg for a constitutional convention because they are prepared to kick our asses. They have been tackling state houses, the Republicans or the conservatives, more, forget the Democrats. I'm not, folks, when I talk about this stuff, I'm not like, oh, I love you, Democrat. I'm telling you, strategically, they have targeted the state houses. They have targeted the judiciary. They have targeted this stuff at the low level, and they have literally blanketed across the country this readiness for a constitutional convention. And one of the things they want most is a balanced budget amendment. You get a balanced budget amendment, you may as well kiss your ass goodbye, because there's no way we're solving climate crisis. There is no way you're getting health care. And there's absolutely zero way you're getting free college or anything like that. So if this happens, it's disastrous. And so there's a lot of things that we've debunked on this show alone. I mean, my God, if people are listening, they're walking around filled with armaments ready to go to war in the revolution, the mental revolution, the intellectual revolution. That said, what I'm wondering here is this: as we watch the rhetoric of Joe Biden, as he demonizes China, as he demonizes Russia. Now, mind you, these are not innocent people here all the way. There's all kinds of crazy geopolitical stuff going on. But whenever the U.S. decides to call someone an enemy, my first thought is they're probably not the enemy. They're probably not the enemy. And that's terrible. I hate that I have to look at my own government in that way. But if I'm not mistaken, the idea here of demonizing them allows us the air cover, if you will, to spend money to defeat the enemy, just like we did in World War II, just like we did during Reagan's Cold War, just like we did throughout this. We need an enemy to make the Republicans be okay with spending, and they still haven't okayed it. So what exactly is it that you think is going on in Congress today that is happening as they're demonizing these? Did I get that right? Is that what we're looking at? Or is there a legitimate geopolitical angle here that we're not seeing? Because obviously the Ukraine is a major oil producer. There's a lot of stuff coming out of Russia. You know, I'm trying to figure out, because I know that petrol is a key component to rising inflation. If they change the price of gas, they change the price of everything, because everything is made with petroleum in it.
Well, I mean, in the case of Russia and the Ukraine, as far as Europe is concerned, it's really the natural gas as a major resource. But also the Ukraine is a major food producer, a major exporter of wheat and sunflower seeds and things like that. So there are some very important geopolitical dimensions to that conflict. But, you know, money is in the background too. So the influence that Russia has in the region, and in Europe in particular, has to do with the fact that Europe is really desperate for alternative sources of energy. And right now, Russia supplies them with a significant amount of natural gas. Russia also has some very serious national security concerns from their perspective. If we had, you know, a large presence of Chinese or Russian troops in Canada or in Mexico, we'll be panicking. We'll be pushing back the same way the Russians are pushing back the presence of the U.S. and NATO in the Ukraine. So those are real issues, and they're not going to go away unless there's serious negotiation between both sides to de-escalate the situation. But unfortunately, what we've been seeing the last few weeks, with the exception of the last couple of days, is mostly escalation on both sides. So diplomacy is what ends these things, and diplomacy is what's going to calm down the situation. Now, when it comes to the U.S., I don't really understand why the Biden administration is trying to escalate a conflict in that part of the world when we can barely manage the crises that we're dealing with right now here in the U.S. with the pandemic, with the inflation situation. The only thing I can think of is an old trick that politicians used in preparation for an election or re-election, and I hope and pray that it's not the case, but it certainly looks like it. And it's not going to distract people from the inflation concern. It's not going to distract it. I mean, the idea that, kind of playing the patriotic card with finding an external enemy all of a sudden is going to convince my neighbors here that they should vote for Democrats and not Republicans, and not worry about their paychecks, and not worry about inflation, and not worry about the COVID situation. I think it's a very dangerous strategy and ineffective strategy at the end.
Well, Fadhel, I really appreciate your time here. This was great. Folks, follow Fadhel Kaboub. If you don't do anything else today, Fadhel is the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, and he's also a very, very good friend of mine, and somebody who I always lean on for knowledge. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. And is there anything else coming up over there at GISP that we should know about? Anything you're working on that would be of interest?
Well, follow us on social media. We're pretty active on Twitter and Facebook. We have a great webinar coming up on Tuesday next week with Pavlina Chernova, myself, and a couple of my colleagues for the Green Jobs Report. If you go to esgx.org, you'll find the Green Jobs series, and you'll find us next week at 5 p.m. We're calling this webinar "MMTers at the Gates." So join us. I think we're breaching the gates, and they're panicking. They don't like it, so that's why they're freaking out.
All right. Well, look, Fadhel, thank you so much for joining us, man. We'll talk to you soon. Colin, thank you so much for having manning the back channels for me. And I guess that's it, folks. I want to see. Hey, Colin, can you bring up some of these comments? I'm looking through here, and I think that ultimately, if we bring up, there's some comments right there from a guy named Mike, and I'm trying to scroll through here, and I believe it's Mike Cole. Before we let Fadhel go, I want to kind of get this out there, because if I could scroll faster, there it is. He says, private banks create 97% of the money via today via loan origination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is the standard discussion that the AMI gang does. Real quick, let's just, while I've got an expert on, let's just smash that one through. Talk about the role of banks and how we can control banks and stuff like that. Start with zero interest rate policy, whatever it is that we need to do. Talk about that.
Yeah, so we get this all the time, or in the MMT community, where we say the government is the monopoly issuer of the currency as in dollar bills and coins. Nobody can counterfeit those. It's illegal, obviously. But banks do create money. They don't print money. They create money through the process of lending. And they can only do that legally because we have a banking license given to them by the federal government under certain guidelines to serve the public purpose. So we can take away those banking licenses, and as a result, take away their capacity to create money to lend for productive purposes. But the guidelines is in the hands of policymakers, the lawmakers, the regulators who tax and regulate the system. When we forget that they're actually in the system to serve the public purpose, and when our lawmakers forget that, and they think that they need to borrow from banks in order to spend for the public purpose, then we're in trouble. So what we've been saying in the MMT community is that if banks are in the process of creating money, lending, which is why they have that capacity, very powerful presence in the system, it should be not for speculative purposes. It should be for productive purposes. And if they don't follow the guidelines we set for them, and if we've removed some of the guidelines for them, then shame on us, the public, for not calling on the federal government to better regulate and tighten those regulations and direct the role of banks to its initial purpose, which is serving the public purpose, funding the investment in infrastructure and housing and transportation and innovation. And if they deviate from that purpose and use their privilege for speculative purposes, then it's our responsibility to call on our elected officials to do better. We have the capacity to shut them down. We have the capacity to take away their banking license and give it to the post office and give it to community banks, give it to public banks. So it's the responsibility of the federal government to regulate the money creation power that they've franchised out to private banks. Just like we've given them that privilege, we can take it away. But the AMI narrative that many people bring up and say, oh, most of the money is created by banks, fits into the belief and the narrative and the myth that we, the public, the government, actually need to borrow money from banks and need to use
ridiculous.
The resources they have in order to fund programs. And if we ban them from money creation and take all money creation under the government, then maybe we'll have a better democracy. Well, the thing is, you can't really ban money creation, because what money is not based
Crypto!
on gold or silver or anything. Money is essentially a contract, a legal document. So nobody should have the right to ban me from signing a piece of paper that says, Steve, I owe you a cup of coffee, right? I owe you. That's what money is. It's a contract. It's a legal agreement that says, I'll deliver a particular thing at a particular time under certain terms and conditions. In this case, it's a cup of coffee. Well, that legal contract that we sign, this IOU, could be delivering a truck, could be delivering a container, could be delivering vaccines, could be delivering anything. So then I can take that piece of paper that says cup of coffee or a container or vaccines or whatever, and I can monetize it. I can leverage it. I can take it to another bank and say, hey, Steve owes me a cup of coffee or a container of vaccines or whatever. Would you give me cash and take this piece of paper? And then I can turn it into cash. It's a real asset that has a real, economic value behind it. So you can't really, quote unquote, ban the money creation. You can regulate the terms and conditions under which I can take that piece of paper and create derivatives out of it and use it for speculative purposes.
Let me jump in real quick.
Comes in.
The Glass-Steagall repeal gave us a total Wild Wild West once again. It literally ripped the Band-Aid off and said, let's go back to a time where we could just destroy the economy. So ultimately, we have shadow banking. Shadow banking is like something that you can't really regulate, because they're not creating money in the sense of currency, but they're creating money in terms of contracts, right? They're creating these arrangements. So you don't need cash to do that. You can do that any number of ways. I mean, anything can be done that way. So the idea that you can stop it in its tracks is, we've seen crypto will find a way, something else will find a way. They always find a way. So at some level, you have to understand that transacting with one another is really what this is about in the end. So I'll give you the last word, and then we're going to go ahead and close out, folks. This was a great time tonight. Let me just tell you, I was very happy to be sitting in the big guy's chair tonight. Very, very great honor to do that. And I'm very, very happy to be in front of you all. So thank you. Fadhel, last word. Take us out on inflation.
Well, it's really important that we win this fight, this debate, because they're in the process of hijacking the narrative. The gatekeepers of the establishment are reaffirming the same old narrative that we can't afford to spend more. We need to cut spending. It's okay to throw people under the bus until we're out of this inflation cycle. And they're not gonna, number one, tame inflation. They're going to cause a lot of pain to the most vulnerable people in this country and beyond, and still use the narrative to say that more spending in the future on climate change, on healthcare, is unaffordable. The only time they allow for a little bit of spending is just a little bit to deal with a pandemic, a little bit to deal with a recession. And it's mostly to the top. I mean, who's running all the way to the bank laughing with flush with cash? It's the big corporations, it's the pharmaceuticals, It's all the people we've been pointing to, and they say, no, 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 it's not their greed. It's all the spending we did on. So it's very important for us to push back, to point to the real sources of inflation, and to push with well-informed pitchfork, as opposed to just anger and populism and kind of empty rhetoric about who's right and who's wrong.
Thank you so much, Fadhel. That's it. Have a great night. Go kiss those kids. Give that wife a hug for me, and have a good night. Thanks for all the hard work you do. You got it, man. You got it. All right. So, folks, this is my first time sitting in for Jordan, and let me just tell you, I enjoyed the living hell out of this. This was fantastic. I'm going to plug myself. Please check out our stuff over at Real Progress in Action. Please check out my podcast, Macro and Cheese. You can find it on any other podcast platform. Guys like Fadhel and Rohan come on my show frequently. So if you want deep dives and all this stuff, I have the experts come on there. But let me just tell you right now, Colin, bring me back in here. This channel is possibly the greatest channel out there. I love what Jordan does. You know, he knows what he's good at, and he knows what he's not good at, and he brings in those experts that are really good at what they're doing. And I want you all to support Status Coup with all you got, because this is one of the very few places that has not caved into nonstop conspiracy theories, nonstop hair on fire insanity, nonstop Alex Jones love. We are watching one guy try really, really hard to be accurate, to do the investigative journalism, and to literally work himself to the bone to the point where he's stressed out. And that's why Grumbine's sitting at the table tonight. So please, please, please support this channel. Come check out my stuff. I hope to God you guys have a great day. I'm Steve Grumbine tonight with Status Coup. Have a good night, everybody. We're out.